Okay, let's do this thing. All right.
All right, welcome everybody to another week of the Woodall's Campground Management Webinar, WCM Fireside Chats, Zoom meeting, Facebook Live, podcast, whatever the heck we're calling it this week. Still seems to change it up. He's going to go live on Facebook here, and then we're going to start. Today's guest is Christine Taylor, who's a super fancy lawyer somewhere in downtown Manhattan in a high-rise with a corner suite. The name of her law firm. Works with a lot of campgrounds, a lot of expertise here. We're going to talk about some of the legal liabilities that campgrounds need to potentially worry or not worry about as it relates to coronavirus. We ready to go, Ben?
Yeah, we're ready to go on Facebook. So,
started. I have a super important question, Christine, as it relates to liability. I have to sit near this open window to get the correct light on my.
Hello.
Oh, I think we lost.
The worst possible moment, yeah.
That's okay. Yeah, I like his pose there in the video. So I think that'll work really well.
You look perfect on the M5. So would it come in? I mean, it's a legitimate question. I mean, we're going to take this in all kinds of different directions, right? So.
Well, what was the question again? You kind of blanked out. You froze.
Totally froze.
Okay. So the question is because I have to sit near the window to get the appropriate light to make the WCM Fireside Chat look good as Quiggle wants.
Oh,
if
God.
a virus comes through the window and infects me, is Quiggle liable?
No, not generally. So liability isn't as tenuous as people would say. Now, if Ben knew that there was a risk, and it was like he knew that you have somebody who likes to stand outside your window who's infected, and forced you to sit there, and you didn't make that of your own choice, there would be more likely to be a liability assessed in that situation. But generally, if there's too tenuous of a connection to draw, there wouldn't easily be liability assigned to Ben in that consideration.
I'm on the 4th floor and very few people can stand outside my window.
I'd say it'd be pretty unlikely at that perspective. Unless he's like sending you mail that's, laced with COVID, I think you'd have a hard time tracing that back to Ben in that scenario.
I mean, jetpacks are a thing. People could float.
That's true. I mean, if we are utilizing technology to target you, you must be.
You're going to see some of this stuff, right? There's going to be people who do all kinds of lawsuits for all kinds of crazy things.
You're not wrong. We actually are starting to see some COVID-related lawsuits start to pop up. One of the most interesting ones for us that's popped up recently is in New York, for example, there is a mandate by executive order that businesses are supposed to enforce people wearing their masks, but there is a caveat that if they can't for a health-related reason, they don't have to. Now, that applies to both employers and for businesses and their consumers in general. And we had been hypothesizing what happens if someone actually says they cannot wear a mask because of their health-related reason. And we were curious if there would then be a disability claim coming back. So best practices for that we've decided that you still ask them those questions you're mandated, but if they say that they have a medical reason that they can't wear a mask, that you might not want to try to enforce them wearing that mask because you could implicate all these other protections for medically disabled people that we have because we haven't ceased having those because of COVID. So it is kind of.
Here's an interesting question just to throw into the discussion. This morning I was reading Delta Airlines is starting to now enforce that if you claim you have a medical condition, they're encouraging you to stay home. But if you do, then you have to do some kind of virtual consult before they'll let you board the plane. And then they'll decide based on that consult whether you can fly or not.
So businesses can definitely still refuse you. And I think it's going to be more problematic with the employee side. So if you have an employee who doesn't want to wear a mask because of a medical issue, because you generally have to kind of accommodate them, that's part of our national law. I'll have to defer to you if Canada has something similar in that. But generally, we cannot, we have to give reasonable accommodations to our employees for those kind of medical disabilities. Now, a private business can generally refuse whoever they want as a consumer, as long as it's not for a discriminatory purpose. So that you generally have more. Medical hadn't really been a thing. Now, just like generally, like I have a compromised immune system. If you say it's because they're not wearing a mask. That's been okay so far. And then as you've seen in the companies have kind of come up with other fail-safes. So you don't want to wear a mask, but then I have to talk to you more about it. Or you don't want to wear a mask, but then I want you to sign this waiver. I mean, in fact, some of the teachers I know going back to school, their school districts have made them sign essentially waivers all the way up to death, that if by going back to teaching and you die of COVID-19, you're not going to sue your school district. So I've been seeing a lot of ancillary documents and policies to kind of fix that, hole that ends up because someone doesn't want to wear a mask or can't wear a mask or something like that. They come up with all these extra things.
Because you're seeing, look at the flip side, right? Like, let's say I'm trying to protect my employees. I understand they have anxiety or they have a medical condition that requires, and I don't want to make them wear a mask. But then the flip side of that is what if I own a restaurant, or there's other people that are working side by side with that employee? So there's two sides of it's a mess.
Yeah, I mean, for us in our country, because we have those extra laws they put in and expanded the FMLA, there are some, frankly, there's some notion that maybe we should pay our employees to stay home or give them that medical leave if they have a medical issue. That's why we're still trying to enforce as much as your position can be remote, it should be, especially in those scenarios. So it's made for some creative employment opportunities and ways of treating employees. We've had some businesses in other industries, if someone came in and their other employees didn't want to, they're paying everyone a salary, but the people who are coming in, they're giving them extra hazard pay or something like that to make up for that and still have them come in. It's a time of weird creativity, and overall you do want to be safe. You're right. That's where that liability we joked about in the beginning would come in. If you're knowingly putting your employees or customers in a situation where you know that they're likely to get exposed, or you're not cleaning or doing something because you've given all these accommodations, it's a problem, because you then have that liability because you have that knowledge and you made that choice to not protect them. So then if they got sick, it likely could be a workers' comp claim at this point if your employee got sick and then you didn't do the things you were supposed to protect them. And it could even get outside of that because you were super negligent in not enforcing these policies, especially if you have a governor or state or whatever directive kind of telling you what to do and you chose to sideline that. So
it's a really good point, though, and just coming at you from, I'm an employer too. I don't have people working side by side and all that kind of stuff, and we're not having in-person team meetings, but you bring up a very good point. How do you know that when one state says it's true, one state says it's false, the president says something else, the governor says something else, the health department says something else? So, I mean, how do you...
It's really hard. We're getting a lot of lessons in our country about our kind of overall hierarchy of law. So, which is crazy because these are things that average people have never had to think about before. But generally, you have your federal law, and states can be more restrictive, not less restrictive. And it kind of goes down the pipeline like that. So like a county might choose to be more restrictive than the state, and then the town might choose to be more restrictive than the county. Like they can implement more rules, they just can't implement less rules. So that's why we saw in New York, especially when this was first rolling out and allowing campgrounds to open, for example, a big discrepancy in neighboring counties. You're like, we're literally 5 seconds away. Our property borders the county, and it'd be like, well, our county says no, but this county says yes. And for a long time, the state had held back on issuing some kind of statewide proclamation about campgrounds and stuff like that. And that's why it's been so hodgepodge. So people who own businesses in multiple states have had to implement different policies. And I frankly think that's why we're seeing some of these big businesses like Walmart or whatever institute company-wide policies instead of the state one, because it's a lot easier to say every Walmart you have to wear a mask than, or following the New York law here, the Massachusetts law here, the Texas law here. By making it a company-wide mandate, they kind of just solve that problem for themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So what do the campground owners, what should be their main focuses when it comes to employees, I guess, as far as keeping them safe and making sure they don't have any liability issues, I guess?
So you absolutely need to follow whatever your state directives are. So start there. So if your state says that your employees have to wear a mask, or you have to hang plexiglass, or you have to take their temperatures, or you have to, what is some of the other ones? Ask them questions like, had they been to a hotspot or in contact with somebody who had the virus? All of that is super important. I mean, for example, like, here's my mask I wear when I leave my office. We take my temperature when I come in. Like, we're a law firm and we're doing all of that. So that's our state mandate for I'm in Albany, New York, and that's what we have to do. So start there, definitely do that. Make sure you're abreast of how that's changing, because it's changed a lot for us. It went from a suggestion to being mandatory to being, you can be fined if you're not enforcing it. And the last thing you want when you're already trying to fluctuate and handle different finances is to get hit with all these fines. And they've made a lot of these anonymous complaint hotlines. And if you don't have a good relationship with your town or your neighbors or whatever, you don't want them calling those hotlines for you. So the first thing you should do is
happening, right? Because we've known like of campgrounds who have neighbors who don't like all the noise and activities on the weekends. And now here's the perfect opportunity for them
to stick it to them. Yeah, no, it's absolutely happening. I mean, case in point, you'd think that the government who shut you down would be on your side when you're trying to enforce them, but that's not necessarily been the case either. We've seen some poor campgrounds who couldn't open on time with when they planned on opening. And then as a result, we had them going to every possible avenue, Better Business Bureau, attorney generals, or whatever, to say, hey, you didn't open when you say you were going to open, so you should have to give me a whole refund or something like that. And you would think the government would be like, oh, it's my fault, that's why you couldn't open. But that's not the stance they've taken. They've actually been like, you haven't held up your contract. And you're like, I can't hold it up. You're the one who told me I couldn't do it. And they actually haven't been quite lenient with that really at all. We've had to show, we have a policy of not being non-refundable. We have these really good license agreements, which, I mean, says to me that going forward, it's going to be about the paperwork, because the only way we've been winning these arguments is because people agreed to things in advance in this paperwork, and we could prove they signed it and all of that. So I know that in the campground industry, especially when my parents started like 20 years ago, the idea of having a ton of paper that everybody signed was kind of ridiculous. But moving forward, I think we're going to have to, at least for the next 5 years, have very good paperwork that follows our country's, states, whatever laws, and make sure that people know expressly what they're agreeing to come, because having to defend these lawsuits that can come out of all sorts of things, even these stupid breach of contract lawsuits, litigation is expensive. Like, on the lower side, it's $20,000. Like, it's not a cheap thing to hire attorneys to help you if someone comes after you.
So I guess, some of the questions I've been seeing on the campground owner forums relates back to the liability, and it kind of gets to Brian's question about how liable they are if people get sick at their park. I guess are they liable for that? Are there different scenarios?
Yeah, you can be liable. First,
nobody knows anything yet.
Right. I would say I would put it in the form of your general liability. Like, think about it like your slip and falls, or I have a piece of playground equipment that's broken. If you have knowledge of something and you've done nothing to remedy the issue, that's going to be very problematic for you. So if you know your employee Sally has symptoms that are very close to COVID-19, and you continue letting her work, and you let her check in every guest, and she's interacted with every single person, and you didn't send her home or have her get tested, and then suddenly you have a big outbreak on your park, you're likely going to be more liable than someone who, anybody who had a temperature or, whatever you sent home. Like that scenario, you had knowledge, you might not have had exact knowledge that she had it, but it was close enough that you could have inferred that there was a problem there and you ignored it, you're going to be more liable. If you don't follow your state rules, you're going to be more liable. So these are all those kind of things. So if you did everything you were supposed to, someone signed a waiver, it was very clean, you limited interaction, you followed every directive that was out there, and someone still got sick, they're going to have a hard time tracing it to being your fault, right? So that's more tenuous. You didn't have knowledge that someone had it, you did everything you were supposed to do. And the fact is, since this is a disease that's so hard to pinpoint to your starting point, I don't know if I got it at the grocery store, the gas station, whatever, if you make it so it looks like you did everything you were supposed to do, that's definitely going to lessen your liability. It doesn't mean they're not going to sue you and say it's your fault anyway. They might, people are litigious, but you'd have a lot more to defend yourself and be like, well, how are you going to prove that it was me? I did everything I was supposed to. And that might be where their case falls apart then.
I mean, and it seems like camper to camper too would be difficult for the campground owners to control. Like if a camper comes in and then infects another camper, I guess that seems like it would be difficult, but that's kind of where the paperwork, you have the camper sign the paperwork, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, generally I'm pro waiver, liability waiver anyway. So this is just something you're kind of adding to that. Again, every state, every country, whatever, has different laws about it. But generally you start from you're assuming the risk. Like that's what we talk about. So like, that there are risks inherent to choosing to camp, and now there's just more. And if you chose to leave your house and go camping anyway, you're assuming that risk. Like there is one there. I mean, it's something you sign when you get them on the back of your parking stubs when you like go to a parking garage. If you like flip it over, they're like, you assume the risk of parking here and we're not responsible for your stuff. Or you go to a ski resort, it's on the back of your ski tag. Like it's not something that is unusual in the world overall, and I just see them getting longer. It's just something us as campgrounds hadn't been applying as significantly as these other industries. I mean, you get them in hotels for certain things, like, if you use the safe, they have a safe waiver. Like these aren't weird things, it's just things that are gonna have to become more prevalent in our industry now.
Yeah.
A lot of what you're saying goes back to what the campground owner is doing and whether they're following guidelines too. Because if you're talking about one camper getting another camper sick, well, were you enforcing the mask policy? Were you, enforcing social distancing? Did you have activities where everybody got together? And so I think a lot of it is the same answer that you're saying.
Absolutely. And I mean, that stinks. It really does. I mean, part of what makes camping so great and different from being in a hotel is that camaraderie among other campers, right? Like when you go to a hotel, you're not knocking on the other hotel doors and hanging out with those people. I mean, most people probably aren't, but as a campground, you pass people when you're walking by, you're all out at your campfires. Like there is that sense of wanting to congregate and be together, and it's very hard to separate people. And the last thing I know campground owners want to do is have to police their guests all the time. Like that's exhausting. They frankly probably don't have enough staff to do it. And that it doesn't make for happy campers, which is the last thing you want to do is have a campground full of aggregated guests. So, from that perspective, it's not something that they want to do, but it's unfortunately kind of something we have to do, or at least show that you did your very best to do so. You can't be everywhere at every time, and people are going to choose to break the rules anyway. But if you see an apparent violation, then you are going to have to address it, because that's the only way to protect yourself, to show that you made it a policy to address those issues and enforce those rules, because your defense is in your practices. If you only do it one time, then you can't say that I always do this, so there's no way I would have let that happen. You're gonna have to do it every time, which again is not fun, but at least unlike some other things, like a gym, for example, in New York still can't be open, at least we can be open. So it's rough, but at least we still can have guests come and stay with us.
Christine, do you have recommendations for how to record and keep track of all of those practices and changes that you're making?
Yeah.
So down the road, you can protect yourself?
You're right. A lot of that is recording and keeping it. So if you are a computer savvy person and you want to keep it virtually, that's great. If you're a paper person, you want to keep it in paper files, that's fine. If you're a both person, you can do that way. But you want to have it in an easily accessible way so you can go to it immediately if you need it. So if I have a big file box that's labeled every year, and here's, Bob Smith signed this piece of paper, I can pull it out here, or you go in your computer and you find Bob Smith, there's a scanned copy of it. Either is fine, just be able to quickly find where that is. So if Bob Smith comes back and sues you, you can pull that out, because the statute of limitations on these lawsuits are not the end of your camping season. They could last a lot longer past that. So unfortunately, you might think everything's great and you make it to October and you close your campground down and it's fine. But if they decide to come back and get you after that, they still could for a bit of a time frame. It's different per state and obviously per country, but it's not going to cease immediately when that camping season is over.
And we've talked a lot about, go ahead, Kara, sorry, you had a follow-up.
Well, I was just going to say, does it make sense to be really recording things like what you covered in your staff meetings and the kinds of policy changes that you've implicated and those kinds of things? How do you you know, in the case of someone suing you, now you have all of this documentation to say, these are all the mitigating steps we took.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would start by putting anything you're changing into writing. So telling your staff is great, but I'd put it in writing first so you could show that you handed it out to them, and then they have something to refer to. And then if somebody sued you, you could be like, look, this is the policy they were trained to follow. Because let's be honest, even right now, I'm sure people will hear some of this, retain some of it, and forget a lot of it. Like, it's very hard to retain what people are telling you. I think they say something like, in class, kids get the beginning and the end and miss the middle. So putting something in writing first, especially what you can refer back to, is super important, because that points to what the exact policy is. And then training is really important. So you have to know that you've trained every employee, and you have to be able to say that you've trained every employee. And God forbid someone had to interview or depose or ask questions of your employees, they would all say, yes, I was trained on this policy. I was given that policy. So that is all good things. The more you can document, the better, right? Like, all it does is make your defense stronger. So the more you have, the better your defense is. And again, I know, especially campgrounds, we run very limited staff. So it sounds like very daunting to take on all these new things, but it's just something, if you can get some policies together, if you have a good organization that can, you know, aggregate some of that and put that together for you to maybe lessen that burden. But it definitely is something you should have, so you can refer back to it in the event you needed it for anything.
And I would think for something like this, cleaning logs and stuff might help with that too, like the bathroom cleaning logs and everything.
Sure, it definitely can't hurt. Like, if you have a policy, my only caution would be, if you make a policy, you have to do it. So there were some people who were like, I'm going to say that I clean every 3 hours. Great, but actually clean every 3 hours. Because if you're not, then that means your policy is nothing and you have no defense, because they can prove that you're not actually, you know, cleaning every 3 hours. And when they ask people, so don't make a policy that you can't uphold. That would be my big caution, because I know a lot of people are like, I'm going to go most restrictive, but then if you don't actually do those, then it's not doing you any favors. Don't do that.
Well, see, I think that's the balance too, right? We talked a little bit about, and this is what I was going to ask earlier, we talked a little bit about how regulations are different from federal, state, local, communities, counties, cities, whatever. So if you're talking to a campground owner who's either one of your clients or a potential client who you're advising, do you advise that since these things are changing so quickly, is it better to follow your state, or is it better to do your best, like you said?
Well, I mean, the best practice would be to follow your state guidelines. That will give you the most protection. I mean, these executive orders are law. So you do kind of want to follow what's out there. That is your best practice.
Just to clarify, what I meant is do your best, like go above what the governor's.
Oh, so you absolutely can if you want to. I mean, if you can follow even a more restrictive regime than what's being asked of you, go for it. If you can't, at the very least, you should be doing what's the most restrictive out there that applies to you. In the Northeast, we've seen a lot of counties and towns issuing their own requirements. So they're like, here's your campground license, but if you want this, you have to do these 12 things, which aren't in the state things, they aren't in the federal things, but as a condition of granting them that actual license, they gave them 12 more restrictions, and in which case, you have to do those as well, because that's the only way you're going to have your appropriate license. And you don't want to do something this season or however long this lasts that jeopardizes your relationship and ability to get your license and paperwork and all that stuff you need in the future when this isn't happening. Because unfortunately, whether it's the legal system or your town municipality or whatever, there's still people, and people tend to hold grudges and, you know, remember when you did something that was wrong. So don't do something wrong now, because it might jeopardize your relationship with them in the future.
I know this whole situation seems to have an emotion, you know, there's an emotional aspect for a lot of people. And like, you know, obviously Walmart was a little hesitant to do the mask because they didn't want people confronting their workers. And you know, some businesses have been a little scared of that. I guess, how many of these lawsuits are emotional? Is there a way for like campground owners, you know, I imagine campground owners should be, you know, less confrontational, I guess. How confrontational do they get when people aren't following the rules?
I mean, I mean, at some degree, it is, but it's always emotional. I mean, if your rules are don't set firecrackers off on my property and people are doing it, like you've always had an emotional thing there. Like, why are you enforcing it to me? Why are you doing this? Why are you targeting me? You know, these are the worst owners ever. That's such a strict regime at their campground. It's no fun. Like that's always existed. It's just we have a new thing that's causing it. I mean, the only caution I can say is that if you enforce it against Bob, you have to enforce it against Sally. It's the consistency that's gonna be most important. Now, I'm not asking you to get into brawls with your consumers, but if it got to the point where Bob wasn't wearing his mask and you told him 7 times and you had to remove him from the park, you can't let the next person get by. You have to treat them to the same standard. That's going to be the more thing. Like maybe Bob was the worst seasonal guest you ever had, so you wanted to get rid of him anyway, or Sally, you know, you've never had a problem with before, so you're willing to look the other way. You can't do that in this scenario because that's you could get hit with a discrimination thing if either of them belong to a protected class, which again would be different in your state, locale, etc. And B, like that's not going to help you showing if you got a general COVID-19, I got sick on your property thing, because you don't have the consistency and enforcement of your policies. So yeah, it's emotionally charged, but I think the most important piece is to remember, like, it's not emotional for you. You have to apply it consistently. And I think, frankly, it's easier for your guests if they see it's being complied consistently to everyone and not singled out, because yeah, new rules stink, but if everyone has to follow them, it's a lot better than, you know, people thinking you're targeting them specifically.
I think one of the things we really need to hammer home here is that there's a lot of opinions about whether these guidelines are legitimate, whether they should be followed, whether they shouldn't be followed. But the point is that your opinions don't really matter. The law is what matters.
Absolutely. Because our problem is we've made this about opinions. I mean, frankly, Canada, I know, is doing a lot better in some areas than the United States because, and I can say that because my in-laws are all in Canada, they haven't been so opinioned about it. It's if it's the law, they've followed it. And unfortunately, because we are a large country with smaller independent governmental bodies, our states, provinces are much bigger, we have a lot more little different laws going on. And thing is, if you want to be a citizen or you want to be a business in that state, you have to follow those states' laws. And if you happen to be a tourist in that state, I don't care if you came from another state where it was different because they believe something different. You wanted to be able to come to that state, you still have to follow those states' laws. And I think a lot of the way to head this off at the pass is, whether you're taking reservations online or on the phone, you should make it explicitly clear what they're going to be held to when they come in. Like, update your website, update your materials, head it off at the pass. If they're not willing to follow those laws to camp at your campground, then they should find somewhere else to go, because you don't want to increase your liability. You're not going to take on that burden because someone's opinion is that the law isn't the right way to do it. Like, you have a business and you don't, they're not the business. And yeah, it stinks. And yeah, people might say things about you on Facebook or whatever it is, but like, you following the law is not a bad thing. And unfortunately, that has to be your bar right now. Like, this is the law and this is what I'm enforcing. It doesn't matter what my opinion is about it. It doesn't matter what yours is, but this is the law. Just like, you know, we don't rob everybody and we don't go in everybody's camper. Like, there are just some inherent laws that we follow, whether you think they're ridiculous or not. Like, California has jaywalking laws, right? Like, everyone jaywalks in New York City, but you wouldn't do that in California because you know you could get a really big hefty fine for it. Like, that's just the law. Like, you have to follow the law of the place that you're in. And yes, it stinks to be the one that has to enforce it, but that's the safest thing for you as a business owner, is to make your baseline whatever that law is.
Right, because we're talking about liability, but we've talked about the baseline, right? The bare minimum you should do is what your state government says. And then if you can do better, by all means do it, if that's what you want to do or that's what you feel like you can do to protect yourself. But the flip side is I'm not going to do it because my opinion says I'm not going to do it, which is terrible if you ever get sued.
Bad in every regard. Your opinion means nothing in the court of law, and no one's going to back you up. Like, how would you back up that? You'd have to try to find some kind of expert. Like, it's just, if your opinion was, if I don't like the way Brian is treating for me, I'm not going to pay my services, or I'm going to steal from him. Like, okay, that could be my opinion, but that's not going to help me in this scenario. Like, we still we still hopefully live in an orderly society where we follow laws, and every country, everything has their own laws. You know, these are just the ones we have right now. And, you know, it's spinning as a good thing. Like, you know, that we're super clean then as a result. And like, we're trying to give this an environment, and we want to be allowed to be open. This is the parameters to be open. We don't want to be like these things that are still shut down in our state. So if you still want to be able to come and we still want to be able to provide this service to you, then that's why we're all following the law together. Like, it's more work for us. And yeah, it's more for you, but this way we can all still camp together. Like, that should be our bottom line. Like, yeah, this is all more difficult, but yay, we still get to go camping.
I think you mentioned something with the protected classes, wearing a mask, like if it's an employee, you know, if you have a rule wearing a mask. I guess, what are some of the questions that employers can, like a campground owner could ask their employee? You mentioned like maybe taking some extra precautions if they don't want to wear a mask because they say they have maybe a medical issue or something. Are there specific questions you can and can't ask? I guess.
Yes, so generally you can ask people if they have a medical disability. If you try to go into any of these realms, you have to be really careful with where you save this information to. Again, every state's a little different, and you have to keep them in like locked locations that are away from other employee files because people's medical information is really private. But generally the people who are disabled, you might have already had some conversations with them in the past. Like, we had somebody whose employer knew that they were disabled because pre all of this, they had special accommodations for them. So I think it's going to come up a lot in that. Like, you might have to give additional accommodations to someone you already gave an accommodation to. But I'd be very careful and very limited, and divulge very limited information. I mean, part of all of this is if you have an employee or a guest that gets it, you're not supposed to identify them to the rest of the people. I can't tell everyone that Brian has it. Like, that would be me violating that relationship. So it still has to be anonymous, and that's where you reach out to your local health departments and stuff like that to ask how they're doing their contact tracing and things like that. Like, you have to be very careful with that information, and honestly, don't necessarily grab more than you have to. Again, this is going to be specific, but there's big federal laws that had to deal with a lot of this about what we could ask. And frankly, we're diving into territories we hadn't been before with taking temperatures of your employees and guests. Like, I've never taken so many temperatures in my life. And that's not something that a law firm, a dentist, a hairdresser, you know, a campground had ever had to do before, but that is a condition of opening in some of these locations. And if you have that information, you keep every employee's information separate, every visitor's information separate, and in a place where the average person isn't going to come across it. Like, my temperature is my private information, and even though that's all they have for me for this week, like, that can't be to other people's eyes. Like, you have to be very careful with that health information.
In this country, like, you can't even disclose somebody's temperature?
Yeah, I mean, it's your health information, and you wouldn't want people to divulge your health information out there. What's really weird about all this is we're requiring industries that never touched people's health information to suddenly have to ask you questions about sickness and your temperature and things like that and handle your information, which frankly, I feel terrible for the other industries. Like, as a law firm, we understand the legality, and health professionals already had to safeguard your information, but asking all these other industries to safeguard the information of their employees and things like this in these new ways is frankly very difficult, because it isn't something you thought was part of your job previously. So how would you have ever known to look at those laws, or known what you could ask or what you could do or what you're supposed to do with it? Like, that's all new territory.
The reason I asked specifically about temperatures is we've been reading, like, I read a thread from a small business owner who owns like 10 or 12 restaurants, who posted on Facebook and asked, you know, what are people in other countries doing to stay open during these times? Maybe I can get some ideas from you. And one of those was, I think, a restaurant in Thailand who was printing out the employees' temperatures on the bags of food that they got, so everybody would know that they were safe.
No, we have laws that we're not supposed to divulge that stuff. Is Canada the same? Do you know?
Well, I mean, I think we're not in a scenario at this point where you're seeing broad, you know,
temperature taking.
Yeah, unless you're like going into a clinic. You know, I took my son to the pediatrician last week, so they check his temperature when we get there, kind of thing. But you know, certainly not in any areas I've been. You know, nowhere, no grocery store or restaurant or bar or anything that is open is checking temperatures.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. A lot of establishments, at least in this area, are definitely taking their employees' temperatures. And when you take that medical stuff, it's supposed to be separate from the regular personnel file. Like, you can't just plop it in their average, like, disciplinary file. Not everyone is taking customers' temperatures. That's not required. But in some places it is, like offices and things like that, we're supposed to, contained environments. So it's all kind of random. Like, they don't do it at the restaurant, but you would do it if you came into our office. I'd have to take your temperature. And that's partially because New York rolled out these different plans for every industry. So we're kind of doing with what that industry is. But if there's any kind of information you're taking about people that isn't something that, you know, you'd offer publicly, you do have to kind of safeguard it. So like, that's why I said, go ahead.
Fine identifying the temperature with the person though, because we've seen, I've seen a lot of the thermal camera now that, you know, like at amusement parks, they'll automatically do like the heat or whatever to identify temperature.
Interesting. Yeah, no.
Anonymous. Is that the same thing? It's just if you tie it to the person that you can't disclose it, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, because at the same time, I can tell you, like, there's a person, you know, anybody who came in on July 4th, that you might have come in contact with a person who was later diagnosed with COVID-19. That's okay. But I can't say if you were in on July 4th, our employee Bob got COVID-19. You can't say that. So the anonymity does usually make it better. Again, this is gonna be really different depending on where you're located. We have federal laws, we have state laws, we have other country laws. So consulting an employment law attorney kind of in your area would be pretty beneficial to you in regards to how you're handling employee stuff. If you're concerned about that, that's definitely something you should reach out to an attorney to kind of advise you on what you have to do for your reopening plan. We've advised some of our clients like what they need to do with their reopening plan because it is a little bit of an unknown territory. And frankly, it's unknown for us. We're seeing new lawsuits come in that we hadn't thought about and new, you know, things. It's very strange. Like there was the whole conversation about whether getting sick with COVID-19 would be covered under workers' comp or not. Is that a workers' comp claim? I don't know. Like, yes, I think we're leaning towards yes. If they got COVID-19 while they were working for you, then it's probably a workers' comp claim. But all of that's new. Like that's a new thing to add under this umbrella, that this framework we had already, but now it has all these new pieces.
So as a campground owner, can I go up to Sally? She's clocking in for work and she doesn't want to wear a mask. Could I be like, well, you have to get a doctor's note or you have to have some medical proof?
I mean, there in most places you probably can ask for a doctor's note. I mean, generally, if you think about it in the framework we already have, so for the ADA and those reasonable accommodations we're supposed to give, there are things that you can and cannot ask of your employees before giving them those reasonable accommodations, and that's what still applies. So if they have a disability that would fall under the ADA, that makes that, like, that's still the questions and still the framework you would do. What you would do for any other kind of disability in that reasonable accommodation standard is what you can still kind of do now, barring any other directive or whatever that comes out, because frankly, I have no idea. Again, everything does keep changing. I said now's a bad time to be a landlord in New York because we have no idea when you'll ever be able to evict a tenant ever again. So that's just because they keep rolling out new things. So you're going to have to kind of stay abreast of what's changing in your locale, but generally, previously, you had that framework in the ADA to follow for that. That's the one that really pertained to you. I see a lot of people saying, oh, you'll violate HIPAA laws. HIPAA doesn't really apply to a private business. It's always been the ADA. So that American with Disabilities Act, that's the thing that you're gonna wanna go back to start. And again, that's why this might be confusion. I was reading something what they call like the death of the expert, is that everyone thinks they're an expert now since Google's at their fingers, but there's a lot of misinterpretation of laws and things like that. So if you don't know, probably search out somebody who does, because certain things might not apply to you as a private business that would apply to the government or something else, or a hospital. You're not a hospital. So like, be careful that you're actually picking the laws that apply to you and not just like thinking, oh, I'm safe under this one when that one might not have anything to do with you. So that would be my caution on that.
So is it discrimination? And again, this is coming probably an ignorant question from my part because I'm not a lawyer, right? But is it discrimination if I'm just making a blanket policy saying either you wear a mask, everybody wears a mask, period, or you don't come in?
No, not generally, because you're applying it to everybody, right? So that generally isn't. Now, because the ADA for disabilities requires reasonable accommodations of employers, if there is a reasonable accommodation you could give, like going back to the ADA and looking at it, then you have to give that accommodation for that employee. So that was generally like, if someone has a
interpretation, though, be that a reasonable accommodation is to not allow them to wear a mask because it would then endanger your other employees and you?
So your reasonable accommodation could be you don't wear a mask, but you still have to work from home, or you don't wear a mask, but you have to stay in this plexiglass box, or you don't wear a mask, but you're going to be by yourself the whole time. Like that would be.
Or you're a restaurant, or you're, you know, like if it's impossible for you to work from home away from other people.
And that's where I told you some people are paying people to stay home because they are worried about a lawsuit, but at the same time, they're worried about a lawsuit from their other people. So that's how come some of them are paying them to stay home. Now, the thing is that when it gets back to, again, the ADA, it's reasonable accommodation. So like you should hire everybody regardless of their disability, especially if you can accommodate them. But if your job is you know, we have this building that only has stairs, there's no way I can put an elevator in it, and your job is running up and down the stairs. Like, I'm sorry, I can't hire you if you can't go up and down the stairs. There you have a disability. And it wouldn't be a reasonable accommodation for someone to have to backwards put in an elevator building to hire that person. So there's still
use the stairs.
There's still a reasonableness standard. So if you're in a job and there is no way you can accommodate them, and it's like pretty evident, like pretty clear that you can accommodate them, there might be some wiggle room there. But again, because we haven't seen, is COVID-19 itself a disability? Is like, we haven't identified those yet. And frankly, it's going to be the first wave of lawsuits, and we're going to see how the courts come down on it. And then that's going to affect everybody's advice. Don't be the guinea pig. So do whatever you can to like avoid being the one it gets tested out on, because we don't really know. I mean, if you think about where we were last fall when we were talking about all those website lawsuits, like that was a guinea pig. Like nobody knew what the accommodation was for all of that. And you had to figure it out. So unfortunately, we're at another area where we don't know what the result is going to be yet. So if you can do things and accommodate people so they couldn't turn around and sue you because they were disabled under some definition, it might be better for you to do that. Again, we're small businesses and we can't just afford to pay people not to work. So that's where that wrinkle comes in. Like if you're a big corporation, you could do that. But if you're a 5-member operation, you need to get rid of that person and hire someone who can actually be there. You know, that's kind of where the problem is right now. And until we see some of these lawsuits come up, we're not really going to know what the answer is going to be.
I'm sorry.
No, you can go ahead, Brian. Go ahead.
Is there a best guidance to, when we look back, like we were at Coney, fond memories of only dealing with ADA lawsuits. But is there, as you know, with the ADAs and all that stuff, all of a sudden everybody has a service animal.
Yeah.
So we all know it's coming, where everybody's got a mental, or not a mental, well, mental.
Yeah, you know, I mean, the medical condition.
Medical condition, right. So is there, how do I know there's no answer you can give me, but is there how do I balance that, right? Between not wanting...
There's a super safe on one guard and the super safe on the other. So this is what we were opining about when we saw the laws first coming out. Like maybe in some scenarios, your best practice is let them in without the mask, but that doesn't mean they're exempt from getting their temperature taken, answering all your other questions, like all your other policies. So maybe they couldn't wear their mask, but they had to do all those other things because it's supposed to be, you know, kind of the package together that's supposed to protect them. Like, I have to do all of those pieces every day I come into work. So like if I couldn't wear a mask for some reason, at least they know that, you know, I don't have a temperature or symptoms, or I wasn't, you know, hanging out with a bunch of people who had it. In that case, it might be, okay, they don't have to wear the mask. We keep them away from as many people as possible, but we also did all these other things. So they didn't show symptoms. They didn't have a fever. They didn't all those other things. Like that might be your best practices to avoid that whole, like, again, what's your disability? Like the questions you can ask for this are like for service animals, we know there's like 2 questions you can ask and a little bit of wiggle room and not a lot, and you're stuck. And that's how people end up with dogs that aren't real service animals and all those things. There is some talk about fixing that eventually. I'm sure that got backburnered with all of this, but there is something on the horizon for that. But generally for this, like, we weren't told that these are the 4 questions we can ask and we're limited and stuff like that, because we're in new territory. Since when was your, office job asking you, if you felt sick lately? I mean, like, that's all very new. So I'd say that if you think that someone is very litigious and problematic and whatever, maybe do all those other things, but let them go without the mask. And then if they are those other things, then definitely refuse them. Be like, no mask, none of these. Like, sorry, you can't, like, you fail on all these. Like, no, you don't have to wear a mask, but you failed on all these requirements. So no, like, you can't be here. But again, it's very difficult. Like, there are some people who are more worried about the liability of letting someone in without a mask. So they rather refuse that one person and take the chance that that one person might sue them than let that person in and have all of those people sue them. So it's going to be kind of if you have a ton of people who don't want to wear a mask, maybe you have to be harsher on that rule. If you have one person, and they're generally okay otherwise, and you have these other parameters, then maybe that's okay. But unfortunately, it's going to be a balancing act based on what happens for you directly. And I'm not sure everywhere has that medical exemption. Like New York, it's like under 2, and if you have a medical reason, you can't wear it. But like, that's literally in our executive order. That's not the same in every state. I know they're all worded slightly differently. So you're going to have to see what yours is exactly. And frankly, that might be your problem. You might get a New Yorker who knows that they could be medically exempt in New York, but goes camping in Massachusetts, and they might not have the same thing. And then they'd be like, well, in New York, I don't have to. Well, it doesn't matter. It's the Massachusetts laws that apply to you at that point. And I think it's the cross-state whatever border thing that's going to be more of a challenge, is the discrepancies in states are going to make it harder for campgrounds to enforce that with their out-of-town guests.
Super great to have a federal plan, wouldn't it?
It would be helpful, for sure. But that's kind of the whole history of our government in general, right? Like, we've given a lot of powers to the states, and in times like this, that's why we get some of this discrepancy between all of them. And it frankly makes it complicated for tourism industries, because that's the very part of tourism, is leaving the place you came from. So that's when you get those other pieces of the law. I mean, frankly, if they ever open the Canadian border again, it will be really interesting for Canadians coming to those very northern border parks, because our laws are obviously very different than what's happening in Canada right now. So that's going to be a whole conversation with.
It does. That's basically.
Well, it's going to be a whole thing to educate your guests. And frankly, you're worried about their electric, their water, the site being clean, cleaning out their fireplace, picking up trash, Now having to educate them on what your laws are regarding mask wearing is, frankly, feels like a huge burden, and it stinks. Like, it really does. I super empathize with that. It's just, unfortunately, like, I'd rather be in the position where we have to enforce that than them re-shutting down campgrounds. So if I had to pick, I guess I'd pick these challenging conversations. That's where that waiver comes in we talked about again. You can solve your other people problems with having them sign those waivers. It's going to be a package way to handle all of this. You have your oral policies, you have your employee policies, you have your customer policies, you have your written stuff, you have your signed stuff. Like, it's going to be a lot of work, and it's going to be a big package, but hopefully you're enforcing it the same for everyone. So you just do this every time. And yeah, it stinks, but I want to stay open. I don't want them to roll back on campgrounds. So I think it's better that we do it than not get the opportunity to.
All right, so we have a question here from a lady I think you may have met once or two. Go ahead, Kathy, ask your question. I just put you live, so we don't have to read it back. Do you want to unmute yourself? Maybe Kathy's there.
That's okay. I can see it.
In the meantime, so I guess let's pivot to this direction, right? What if I have a camper show up at my store, my campground, and they're clearly sick, or they have a temperature when I take their temperature? Do I allow them to camp? Do I not allow them to camp?
Do not allow them to camp. And I think most states have made that pretty clear, that if someone is symptomatic, that you should refuse them, whether employee or customer. I mean, there there were some employees and there's some weird lawsuits because people's bodies kind of run at different temperatures, and it's what temperature is that I refuse them at. Like if they're asymptomatic, but they just happen to be, 99 degrees, do I turn them away because they're 99 degrees? Maybe they're always 99 degrees, or like if some,
I mean, let's play that the opposite way, right? Like, let's say I've got a medical condition that causes my temperature to be 99.9 all the time.
yeah.
How do you do that? I mean, there's so many intangibles.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's part of the problem is we've tried to come up with some way, some baseline, and obviously there's always going to be discrepancies from a baseline, but we have to put it somewhere. And so there are going to be these outliers and these uncomfortable situations because it's going to be different. Like there really is only so much we can do.
All right, Kathy,
Sorry.
go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I've spoken with some campground owners here in Canada who have chosen to stay closed for the summer because of how fearful they are of the impact of some of the laws and requirements. Our Quarantine Act here requires you to shelter in place if you get sick. And that's requiring, if you're already staying in a campground and then you contract COVID-19, you're supposed to quarantine in that campground. So if operators afraid of that impacting their business, so they've chosen to stay closed. Also, I mean, issues with, you mentioned being a landlord. There's certain provinces or certain jurisdictions in Canada where if you have a guest staying longer than a certain number of days, they flip over to the tenancy laws as opposed to kind of regular civil stuff. And now with all of these non-eviction laws and things like that, there's a ton of...
I know, start with them. I know, it's very challenging. I mean, a lot of people can't afford to stay closed, but then at the same time, can you afford to be open right now? I know that's a conversation for a lot of people. Because you might have to have even hired more employees, frankly, to enforce all of these things because it's not something your normal limited staff could have done. So it is a tricky time and a lot of things you have to think about. I mean, unfortunately, with anything else, we adapt, right? So we know that this is an issue now, and if we come up with these policies and this paperwork and stuff like that, if this even proceeds into next summer, next camping season, we'll fortunately or unfortunately, I guess, already have kind of weathered some of this and have it in place. So we wouldn't have to be responsive anymore. We'd already have it. So it might be less burdensome in the future as you adjust. I mean, with anything, change is tough. But again, I mean, the camping industry is obviously doing really well overall. You see that people are buying campers because it's, as we always say in my family, it's nice to have your own dirt and not another one's hotels. And I think that's something that's going to persist as people feel a lot more comfortable in their own, units and things like that, and outdoors in general instead of being inside. And so I think that's all positive, but at the same time, I think that's why we have to now come up with our policies and our written paperwork and things like that, so we can continue operating for as long as this persists.
I mean, it's a good point. I mean, you're talking about quarantine and stuff. What if you're a mom and pop husband and wife team and you come down with COVID and you have to quarantine? Who's running your park?
Yeah, I know. It's going to be very interesting. I think we're going to have to talk a lot more about our employees. I think, unfortunately, I think it's going to put the spotlight on a lot of things that aren't necessarily COVID-19, but created an issue. Like if you were a campground that, against my advice, chose to still pay your employees under the table and not run them through workers' comp insurance and all that stuff, and they get sick and try to file a workers' comp claim against you, and you didn't have them on workers' comp, and then suddenly you open yourself up to a bigger lawsuit because you don't have that workers' comp protection. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of fallout on those ancillary pieces because it's going to put a spotlight on the parts of your business that were kind of suspect to begin with, that now might become more of an issue because you didn't have the proper insurance, you weren't running your employees for the proper things, you hadn't cleaned this appropriately all the times because you just didn't have enough staff. Like, I think the weaknesses are going to be exposed in a lot of campgrounds that they already had, just because it's going to be the fallout of this bigger issue.
Yeah. I think Kathy's there. She can ask her question. Kathy, are you there?
Lord. don't know how to do it.
Just talk.
Hear you.
I just talk?
Yep, just talk.
Kathy, do you know?
Okay. I'm not the greatest at technology.
No,
My
that's
question is, if a camper or employee cannot wear a mask due to health reasons, can you require them to wear the plastic shields I've seen some people wearing?
Yeah, so I mean, the laws have been written for face covering, not face masks. So that's why you see people with bandanas and everything. So that could be a reasonable accommodation. Don't wear a mask, but I'll get you this face shield if that, helps your issue. Or like I said, we put them behind a plexiglass box that they don't have to wear a mask. If there's some way to limit that, that's still an available thing. I don't know how far their disability will go. I don't know if the face shield would still be an issue for them. But it sounds, reasoning it out with everyone here, you'd think, it would be less restrictive to breathing or whatever. So it could be a possibility. You can set those requirements, but I've seen most of the laws are face covering, not mask in general. We've just interpreted that to be mask generally.
We can solve this, Christine. All right, so even if they say that the face covering doesn't work for them, you've seen the giant plastic bubbles that people roll down the hills on, right?
I said we're going to be boys from now on, like that old movie. We're all going to be like a bubble boy and then wear these space suits. NASA can sell off their old space suits and we'll be great. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Case in point, think of it as like business opportunities. I've seen some campground owners with really thrifty sewing skills who've now been making masks and selling them.
Yeah.
So that's pretty awesome. That's a way to be an entrepreneur in light of all of this happening. You see clothing companies making masks that never had before. It's going to give you a chance to kind of see some more inventive ways of doing things and maybe fully embrace the online reservation system. I have some clients that the people book online, they get a barcode online, they literally never have to interact with a human from the time they book it to enter through the gate to whatever. Now's the time, I guess, to fully embrace technology for your campground when you might not have before, because frankly, that probably eliminates a lot of these issues. You need less staff for the front desk. It doesn't matter if that front desk person who's pushing through the thing is wearing a mask if they never actually interact with anybody. There could be creative ways to eliminate some of these issues by employing different technologies and different practices. And again, that's change, that's hard, that could be expensive, but there might be alternatives to adopt to avoid some of these issues.
We talked about jetpacks earlier. They can hover 6 feet above it.
Excellent. I don't know, gravity might not help in that scenario because instead of just out, you'd be worried about down too, but you never know.
That's a lot of fuel costs too. That's a lot of fuel.
That you told her you would answer, and I don't know if you forgot like 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, yep. I was going to get to it. Yep. Yeah, somebody was asking, Terry, I'm going to murder this last name, Blask.
She's on every week, Ben.
I know, but I don't know how to pronounce her last. But anyway, she asked if you could give her a sentence or two that could be used as an addendum to their terms and conditions waiver to release the park if someone gets the disease.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't. So as an attorney, not knowing your location and you not being my client, I can only give you guidance and not actual legal advice. There's strict ethics laws against that. Certain, depending on where you're located, certain organizations have put out some sample text at this point. I've seen some. And if you happen to be in the Northeast, then maybe feel free to reach out and I'll see if I can point you in the right direction. But no, unfortunately, I cannot. That is a big no-no for attorneys. We're not allowed to just give general, I can give general advice, but I can't give you legal advice or those specific words right now to protect me still being an attorney.
So one of the things I do want to do, and I know we're kind of coming up on the end of the show here and you probably are going to have to go soon. So I want to do this. Turn off your attorney hat for a second. And just opinion-based as Christine, right?
Okay.
You own the campground right now.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, doesn't matter what state it is, what would you be doing?
What I'd be doing right now is, frankly, as we've touched on multiple times, is being very clear with my policies, also being very transparent with my guests. I think a lot of it is about expectations. So if I set the expectation that they have to sign a lot of paperwork when they come in, then they won't be upset when they sign that paperwork. Or if I set the expectation that for our safety, you know, even if the state said we could open the playground, we still chose to have it closed, then they know what they're getting into. I think a lot of the disgruntled guests are because it hasn't been conveyed to them what they're doing. And like, that was our problem with that contract. They didn't know when the campground was ever opening. So I think they were more disgruntled about that. And we're in a job of customer service, frankly. That's really the core of it. And I think from that perspective, yes, you have to do all these things and train your employees and make these papers, but I think we have to do a good job of conveying that to our guests, because I think we get to focus more on the fun if we tell them all the bad up front. I know delivering not great news is nobody's favorite thing, but it's a lot easier to get back to the fun making if you can deliver all the bad stuff up front, so they can make those choices if it's worth the fun making in spite of all those bad things.
So is Christine doing temperature checks? Is Christine requiring masks? That's like, I would look at what my state is saying. And if they say for my industry that I'm supposed to be doing that, then I would be doing that 100%. Because that's still your best thing to fall back to. If they're like, why am I doing it? It's much easier to explain to my guests, I'm doing this because the state told me to, than I'm doing this because I felt like it, or I didn't feel like it. So I would do whatever my state says to do 100%, because I think that would protect me in all sorts of fronts. I think it's easier to convey to somebody like, look, it's in the law, that's why I'm doing it. I think that's more understandable for people. And I think we can go back to what we said. It doesn't matter how you feel about it or I feel about it, but unfortunately we're still held to this law. Just like your HOA says that you can't park your camper in your driveway, this executive order says I can't let you in without a mask. And whether we both think that's fair or not, that's still what I'm held to.
And I like what you said about the expectations, because I think when you're doing like temperature checks, you know, if you can tell the consumer before they get to the park, hey, we're going to check your temperature or whatever, if you're going to be doing something like that, then they can decide and have that emotional response if they want on their own at home, or like be like, whatever, I'm not going to that park at home, instead of waiting to get to the park and be like, what are you doing? You know, I'm not going to do this, and then maybe creating a scene, I guess.
Right.
So I really like that. I guess I'm back to the mask thing just real briefly. I did have another question about the mask. So if an employee, so you have multiple employees and one employee isn't wearing a mask, and one of the employees that's wearing a mask is like, why isn't so-and-so wearing a mask? Are you allowed to tell them it's because of a medical issue, or?
Yeah, I mean, if you're pretty, if you're pretty anonymous, you generally have to. I mean, again, I'd revert back to the same thing you always did. So you revert back to the ADA. Obviously, if you had somebody who wasn't doing something about everyone else, or if they got to sit on the job and no one else did, you know, it's going to come up. But I would just always be as vague as possible. Just be very vague to give. Just there's a reason. They have it's a medical accommodation, nothing more. Not like it's medical accommodation because they can't breathe because they have this disease. We love to talk. We're chatty people. That's why we're in a thing with customers. But just very, very short answers, very vague answers. Give as little information as possible. Think about like parent to a child about their Christmas present. Like keep as much out of the equation as possible.
Yeah, we're also hearing a lot about immunity legislation. So I know some states are looking at immunity legislation, and I know the federal government was looking at immunity legislation. I guess I think some park owners may be feeling like this is going to be like a savior to their small bit. I guess, what's your view of immunity legislation?
Well, I think what's going to happen is if it isn't a federal thing, and if the states are still different, then because people are crossing borders, it honestly might just make things a little more complicated. In fact, I don't know how you're going to, if you're in a state that has that and then you have someone that doesn't come from that state, how do you know? Because they weren't keeping that practice up. Do you have to treat them differently? If you have a state that has that and they come in and you don't, then you have to hold them to your state's laws. I think for camping, it's going to be a little bit problematic just because by definition, we're not usually, okay, most of your camping trips might be closer to home, but if you live right by the border like me, when I Google something, sometimes it's closer in Massachusetts than it is in New York. We inherently are going to different locations. So if every state doesn't adopt it, I think it's going to actually create an enforcement issue with your people who are traveling all throughout the country.
So if the federal government, okay, so the federal government gets on the ball and they do an immunity legislation,
Sure.
that doesn't protect you from still getting sued, right? And some of that still will go through the courts, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, here's the thing, and I hate to say this, but there's literally nothing on the planet that stops you from getting sued. Nothing. I don't care if you have a great waiver and your state has waiver, they could still decide to take you to court, and you still might have to do things to dismiss it. So all of these things can protect you from is this fine. All these things can protect you from is that give you more defense, but it doesn't necessarily protect you from ever getting a lawsuit, period. So frankly, you could still get sued. You just want to have everything in place that you can to be like, make this go away. I did everything right. This is more where you're going to be at.
So here's something that fascinates me, and I'm just turn your lawyer hat off again, Christine, right? I want your opinion, right?
Okay.
Talking about this immunity and whether they pass it or not, and I haven't decided whether I like it or I don't like it yet. I like it obviously because I'm a business owner and I understand people need protections. I don't like it because it basically says, well, the business owner can clean or not clean. If I get sick, too bad for me. So as Christine, do you like immunity laws in this specific instance, or are you, as Christine, not as a lawyer, or do you not like it?
That's a tough one. I mean, from a small business perspective, it really hurts, and these lawsuits hurt a lot. And there's a thing between justice isn't always served in the legal system. I mean, I hate to go back to the website thing, but we saw people who did everything right and still got sued. So they still had to pay me to defend them. Like, that part's not right. Like, that doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like justice. And the fact is that a lot of these stupid cases settle because it's more cost effective to make it go away than it is to fight it, even if you're right. And that doesn't feel good. So from that perspective, as a business owner, the immunity thing feels good because it's, I can't be held liable for you doing all of these things. And it's really hard for me to police you. What authority do I have to hold you to all those things? From that perspective, it feels good. I worry a bit about some of those kind of things is because how broad does that go? And are we compromising the safety of people and not knowing what these texts will be and how they will apply? Anytime you insulate someone from liability, people will find a way to take advantage of it. And I'm not saying that small campground owners with 4 employees will be looking for a way to take advantage of that, but I do worry that corporations with a bigger backing power will take that and frankly make your life harder. Like, what if that vendor who came to your campground to give you soda, cookies, milk, whatever, that company decided to insulate themselves with these immunity things, sent your sick employees to you because they didn't care anymore, and then that has a ripple effect for you. So I feel like the small businesses are going to end up bearing a brunt of something that isn't necessarily foreseeable from like the big picture, but like if these other things that are bigger than you, they found tax loopholes, they found all these other loopholes, I could honestly see in the pessimistic view them being insulated for something that then ends up hurting you. So yeah, it would protect you, but it also doesn't protect you from these other people you interact with.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's a great positive note to end on.
So that's my kind of goal here. Like, I just want to get it out there for people and for them to consider.
Yeah, no, I mean, the positive still is that everyone's talking about it, right? Mm-hmm. So we're all coming up with inventive ways to do new things, and there are lots of people and experts and new ways to market coming out and new ways to sell yourself and new ways to communicate, and I think there's a lot of opportunity. So we just have to figure out what all of those are and the safest and best way to employ those.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think we went through a lot of information. Brian, Kara, do you guys have anything else to ask? Or
if you don't like us ending on a negative note, Ben, say something positive.
I don't know, Brian. You could run that bear scenario you did with the insurance people a few weeks ago through the legal expert here.
From the beginning, it's the whole thing outside my window. You want me to come up with another scenario?
No. I really do think the positive is that we're an industry that's allowed to be open. So, and you see, there are people in my law firm who knew nothing about campgrounds until I came along, and now I get all these articles sent, and they are amazed by seeing all the new articles being like, there are no used camper inventories, all these newbies, people choosing to buy campers instead of hotels. Like, we are on everyone's thoughts right now, because we are kind of the new way to get out with your family and see something besides your house, but still be safe and avoid planes and avoid hotels. So I think all of that is positive, as long as you have all your stuff and whatever. I think we're ushering in a new wave of new campers, and that's exciting, because hopefully that's a ripple effect for generations to come.
I think if anything, the eye is on the campground industry, and it's just up to the owners to really be responsible and be good business owners and follow best practices and do the best they can. And I think most are. I mean, we read some stories where we do have some park owners who are being a little bit more lax, and hopefully it doesn't come back to bite them. But I think, they just have to be responsible, and it's a great time to be a park owner, because it's everybody wants to get outside and everybody wants to have those experiences. We just have to do it responsibly. So, yeah.
Which
Kara,
includes a mask, Ben.
what?
Responsible, wearing a mask.
Yeah. I think all of us should wear masks next week. We have to be a good face. So, and Brian, I'm sending you a package this week, like we talked about it.
I'm going to send you a package too.
Okay. But I think, Kara, did you have any other questions to ask or any other comments?
No, I think I am incredibly thankful for all of your insight, Christine.
Thanks. It was fun. Thanks for hanging out today.
Yeah, I can't imagine, you probably had a pretty slow morning planned anyway, so we probably didn't keep you from very much stuff.
Not at all. Definitely didn't send 5 calls to voicemail. We're okay.
So, well, thank you for coming on, Christine. And I mean, you're always a wealth of information, so it's great to have you on. And I hope everyone on Facebook and Zoom got really good information out of it. So,
awesome.
Yeah. So, well, thank you everybody for joining us again, and we'll be back next Monday. So everyone have a great week. So,
bye.
Thanks, guys.